Dzień dobry, dobry wieczór, więc witam wszystkich na dzisiejszym spotkaniu. Przechodzimy na język angielski, ponieważ jak to jest napisane na tym plakacie, będziemy rozmawiać dzisiaj w języku angielskim w sposób taki niestandardowy. So, dear colleagues, dear students, dear all, I'm glad to come back once again in a fortnight to this symbolic hall after our day dedicated to history, the framework of the French Week of Social Science. And first of all, of course, I would like to warmly thank Dean Łukasz Niesiołowski-Spano once again, and all the members of the Faculty of History, especially those who are with us this evening, for the warm hospitality for the second time, and I hope for the next time also. So I would also like to thank our colleagues from the Faculty of Archaeology, of course, and from the other archaeological centers of the University of Warsaw, who have agreed to be involved in the organization of this meeting. I'm very attentive to this collaboration because as a historian of early modern period, I rarely myself have the opportunity to work with archaeologists, but I also know from exchanges with specialists from other periods that we often leave the connection that exists between our disciplines to the margins of our practice. And while this connection in fact are essential for approaching different types of topics in a new and more complete way. I'm therefore pleased to see that the occasion of the conference of Professor François-Xavier Fauvelle, whom I thank once again for accepting our invitation, has provided an opportunity to bring this complementary perspective together, and I hope that this meeting will produce a fruitful discussion. The issue of African history is indeed a particularly suitable case, I think, for this type of dialogue, since it confronts researchers with methodological questions that touch on chronology, but also the very writing of history, with approaches that are very different from the more, let's say, classical frameworks of European history, based on written and narrative sources. At the same time, I would like to underline that the presence of many specialists this evening also shows that the Polish academic world plays a particularly active role in this field, and that in exchange with French specialists, who for historical political reasons, of course, are traditionally involved in the African continent, appears to be a truly consistent approach. So talking about Africa in Warsaw, in the Franco-Polish context, is not so much the expression of, let's say, an exotic curiosity, but first of all, a way of building a real exchange that goes to the heart of our disciplines and allows to develop network research, which seems to be very important, at least to me. Today, however, our conference will be held in a rather original format, since our exchange will take place in English and will have triple aspect. First, examining different epistemological issues. Second one, presenting the early reflection developed by African societies on environmental and ecological context. And finally, retracing the experience of a researcher who has devoted his career to a field that is both very heterogeneous and marked by a form of unity in the challenges it poses to researchers. I will obviously leave it to François-Xavier Fauvelle to present his own scientific past, but I think it's important to say a few words of introduction to show the richness of his experience. Indeed, Professor Fauvelle is himself, let's say, the embodiment of the dialogue I mentioned at the beginning, since he can legitimately be defined as both a historian and an archaeologist. And he has directed several French research centers on the African continent and has coordinated numerous research programs, in particular in Morocco and Ethiopia. Being originally a researcher at the French National Center for Scientific Research, the CNRS, he was elected professor at the Collège de France in 2018, where he was the first to hold its chair specifically devoted to the history of Africa. He's the author of numerous works, among which a collection of essays, The Golden Rhinoceros, as translated in English, has been very successful and has been translated into many other languages, including Polish, in 218, so 5 years before. In 222, he also published the book in French, Pensée, l'histoire. which outlines his epistemological approach and will serve as the basis for today's conference. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank my counterpart, let's say from Prague, the director of the CCFEF, Mateusz Chmurski, who was behind this initiative that led to the organization of meeting and who is with us tonight. So I thank him once again very warmly. In order not to waste any more time, I will now hand over to Professor Marek Pawełczak, who will be moderating this discussion and who is a member of the Faculty of History and himself a specialist of the history of East Africa and Indian Ocean in the 19th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that most of the important things has been already said, so I'm not going to prolong this introduction. One thing that I think that should be stressed is the importance of the translation of the book written by a professor called The Rhinoceros, because for a general reader, non-specialist, that book is in fact the first book in Polish that presents well, the main points on the ancient history of Africa, since the books by Basil Davidson, books that were written in the 1960s and published in Polish I think that in the 70s, and these books I think try to break with some imperial myths concerning the ancient history of Africa, or rather the lack of history in Africa. But unfortunately, Davidson created some new myths that were entangled in political matters. And I think that by contrast to Davidson, Professor writes basic on sound scientific research, and including his own research. And although each history is somehow entangled in politics, I think that in this case, it's the level of entanglement is quite moderate. So I think that I should pass the mic to Professor.
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah. Thank you very much for your invitation. Thank you to Laurent Tatarenko, the director of the French Center, or the Center for History of French Studies Center, and thank you to the colleagues of the History Department. I am very proud of being here, and I must apologize for not being able to speak in Polish. I'm sorry. I will speak in English. A lot of things have been said about my previous work, but let me just say a few more words. On this map of Africa, I pointed a number of places where I conducted work in the past. In southern Africa, mostly among the Khoisan-speaking people. In Ethiopia, where I conducted a number of research on Christianity and Islam, which developed side by side in this country, and I will talk more about it in my talk. And more recently, I worked in Morocco, where I conducted the excavation of the Islamic city of Sijil Massa, which was one of the main emporium gate toward the trans-Saharan trade. And lately, I initiated a work on Mali. I devoted my lectures last year at the Collège de France on Mali. Unfortunately, for, let's say, political reasons or geopolitical reasons, it's now nearly impossible to work in this country, at least to develop archaeology in this country. I pasted a number of books. One that some of you may know is the Rhinoceros d'Or, Golden Rhinoceros in English, and Zloty Nosorożec in Polish. And recently I published this book that was mentioned, Penser l'histoire de l'Afrique, and Les Masques et la Mosquée, The Mask and the Mosque, which was driven from my lectures of last year at the Collège de France. I can make the point that all my lectures at the Collège de France, this is a rule at the Collège de France, all the lectures are public and are recorded and are available for free online. So you just have to click on this link and it is in French. And you can attend virtually all my lectures at the Collège de France, especially the one on Mali last year. You said earlier that doing history, trying to be a historian in Africa involves a lot of several disciplines, several fields. Not only history in the classical sense of the term, that is working on written sources, but also archaeology, also anthropology, also linguistics or compared linguistics, and a number of other fields. So I tried for this talk to design a talk entangling all these different aspects of my work, and I'm going to show you why. The first thing I would like to emphasize is the diversity, the cultural diversity of Africa. It's very common to everyone to emphasize this point, to say that African societies are extremely diverse in terms of political systems, in terms of social organization, in terms of kinship systems, in terms of religion, etc., etc. And one aspect of this diversity is languages. Today, more than 2,500 languages are spoken in Africa, which is much more diverse than, say, Europe, where something like 50 languages are spoken, okay? So 2,500 languages, that's a lot. And the question we may ask is, well, for some people, this diversity, this linguistic diversity, is an opportunity to be mesmerized, by this kaleidoscopic diversity, and it may lead some people to believe that Africa is just made of a huge number of tiny groups living side by side, speaking their own language, embedded in their own milieu, etc. That is not the case. I mean, we can think of this diversity in different terms. This diversity is history, is only the product of history. And let me just detail a little bit more this map. As you can see, four major phyla. Phyla are macro families of languages. Okay, I can just remind you that all the languages, almost all the languages spoken today in Europe, except a few, okay, except Hungarian, Basque, and Finnish, but all the other languages in Europe belong to just one family, okay, and Indo-European. And when you pile up several families like this, you can reconstruct something which is called a phylum, okay? Four phyla are spoken are present in Africa, namely Afro-Asiatic, Nilo-Saharan, Niger-Congo, and Khoisan in the south, plus Malagasy, spoken in Madagascar, okay, which belongs to still another phylum, which is Austronesian. So that's a lot, that's really a lot. And within this phyla, you find several families of languages, and within these families you find tens and sometimes hundreds of languages spoken. I'm going to zoom in one region of Africa on which I'm going to devote part of my talk. This region is the Horn of Africa. So this is the list of the languages that are, you cannot read, it's too small, the list of languages that are spoken in the Horn, in Ethiopia, okay, Ethiopia alone today. There are almost 100 languages belonging to several families, okay? So most of them belonging to the Afro-Asiatic phylum. Semitic languages are spoken in Ethiopia, and it's always good to remember that there are more Semitic languages spoken in Ethiopia than there are in the rest of the world. Okay? At least 20 Semitic languages are spoken in Ethiopia, and many linguists make the point that it's probably in this region of the world that Semitic languages developed. Omotic languages, another branch, another family of the Afro-Asiatic phylum. Cushitic languages are also spoken. And finally, in the south, in this, that doesn't really work, I'm sorry. The mouse does not work, but in the south, in the southwest of the country, that looks like a puzzle, okay? In this region, many Nilo-Saharan languages are spoken. So what can we make of this in terms of history? Well, you can see on this map, which is very telling, two different historical factors have been at play for millennia and centuries. First, a factor of fragmentation. In some region, the languages divided into different languages, okay? And in other region, another factor was at play, homogenization. Homogenization is something that we know well in Europe because it has been the main historical factors that played on our continent. Because some languages have become the vehicle of state or civilization or whatever, okay? And this language replaced a number of languages that was previously spoken in the same region. Let's take France, for instance. It's well known that in France, 2 centuries ago, a number of other languages were spoken, okay? And today, mostly French is spoken everywhere. So clearly, in that case, the state, the centralization of the state was a vehicle of standardization of the language and homogenization of the language, and the disappearance of other language. In Ethiopia, these two factors worked side by side, fragmentation and homogenization. Why was there a process of homogenization? Because there were, in Ethiopia, in the past, big states. Okay? Some of you may know the kingdom of Aksum, in antiquity. Aksum was a very powerful kingdom on the north of Ethiopia and neighboring Eritrea. Aksum was the commanding state of the trade along the Red Sea. And later on, there was a medieval kingdom called Ethiopia, a Christian medieval kingdom, in which Amharinia, a Semitic language, was spoken as the vehicular language. So we see that this linguistic diversity is an evidence of different factors, various factors working side by side, and sometimes contrary-wise, within the same societies. Now, let's have a look in this tiny region where I drew this white rectangle, okay? What happens here is extremely interesting. And in many respects, it explains the diversity. And I'm going to use this example to show how diversity is being made, within a certain social landscape and environmental landscape. Within this rectangle, you see, this is the line, no, sorry, you see absolutely nothing, yes. You see, within this rectangle, a sharp fall in the altitude, okay? This is something which is called the rift, okay, the East African rift. The rift is literally a wall, okay? That means on the left of this rectangle, these are the highlands of Ethiopia. Something between 2,500 and 3,000 meters above sea level, okay? And on the right part of this rectangle, these are the lowlands, the desert. And this rectangle, which is only 30 kilometers long, okay, you have this wall, the highlands, this wall, and the lowlands. Okay? So many things happen here. A lot of things happen here. What you can see here is a picture that I took from the edge of the highlands, okay, through a bridge, okay? And so this photo is taken at 3,000 meters above sea level, on the road, okay? Just on the side of the road. And what you can see the next 20 kilometers toward the east. You can see the rectangle that I drew before, okay? And you can see here a number of steps in the landscape, falling very sharply, okay? What you see at the horizon is just 20 kilometers afar. Okay, and 20 kilometers afar, you are around 400 meters above sea level. Okay, so something like 2,500 meters. Okay, you fall by 2,500 meters in just 20 kilometers. Okay. So there, this is a very important factor to understand what the African landscape is in many regions, not only along the Rift Valley, okay, but also in a number of other regions of Africa. The implication of this Rift Valley here is that a number of different ecological milieus, okay, are coexisting side by side. The highlands of Ethiopia, okay, very cold place, okay, extremely cold, you are literally in the sky, but this is the most densely populated region of Ethiopia. This is where the sedentary people, agriculturalist people live, okay, densely populated. In the south of the country, you have the tropical forest, completely different. In the Rift Valley itself, you have a savanna, and in the triangle, okay, where the Rift Valley opens toward the sea, there you find the subtropical desert. Our rectangle, you see exactly where our rectangle was, okay, along the escarpment at the tip of the first arrow. I'm sorry, is there a pointer? Is it a pointer or not? No, I'm not sure. Yes. Almost. Yes, you see, our rectangle is here, okay? So just here in our rectangle, okay, side by side, you find the highlands and the subtropical desert. These different ecological milieu means a lot in terms of what kind of economy, what kind of food production can take place, obviously. On the highlands, you have agriculturalists and cattle herders who heavily invested the landscape by making agricultural irrigated terraces in the mountain, okay? These terraces that you can see at the top left are made at 3,000 meters above sea level, okay? The bottom left is the tropical forest, which is not a natural environment. The tropical forest has been anthropized, has been transformed by the society who live there. They are literally gardening in this forest, selecting species, etc. Okay? And you find this kind of tiny villages in this region of people who cultivate a number of fruits, vegetables, coffee, etc. In the bottom right image, you see the kind of cattle raised by the herders who live in the Rift the Rift Valley and in the deep south of Ethiopia. If this cow here is decorated, okay, these are decorations made on the cattle. It is because these people heavily invest in this cattle, and that the cattle are the main asset to anyone. Okay, main economical asset, main political asset, matrimonial asset, and cattle play a role in every aspect of the social life of these societies. And at the top right, you see camel herders, for instance, Ifât or Somali people who live in the triangle along the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. I remind you that it is just a desert, okay, and it's impossible to cultivate anything in this region. Now, just a historical reminder. Christianity developed in this part of the world very early on. From the 4th century, in the 4th century, a king of Aksum converted to Christianity, officially converted to Christianity, and with him a number of urban elite of the kingdom of Aksum converted to Christianity. Later on, the Ethiopian Christianity and the Ethiopian kingdom moved slightly toward the south, okay, converting people. This is a process which is not entirely well known, but still we have historical benchmark of this process. What is important here is that in the 14th and 15th century, there was a big Christian kingdom on the highlands within the big circle, yellow circle, okay, 14th to 15th century. This was the region where there was this hugely powerful Christian kingdom who named itself Ethiopia, okay, after a Greek name. This Ethiopian Christianity is well documented in the 14th and 15th century. It is well documented in the Antiquity. It is well documented in the 14th and 15th century. It is not that well documented in the middle, but in the 14th and 15th century, it is well documented, thanks to a number of written sources. Okay, Ethiopian Christians use our written culture and our manuscript culture. Okay, so we know Ethiopian manuscript written in Ge'ez by the thousands. Okay, and they are usually preserved in monasteries like this one that you can see, or maybe not here, really at the top of the mountain here. There is a monastery. Okay, so this is the kind of monasteries that you find in Ethiopia, usually on the top of mountains, that preserves manuscripts. Many of these manuscripts have been microfilmed, okay, and are available to researchers, but sometimes it involves walks in the landscape and discussion with the local church and with the priest and with the community, okay, so that they share or not the manuscript. And so it is well documented because we have all these manuscripts, most of these being Bibles or other religious books, but in many a time we have in the margins of these manuscripts a number of historical documents. Okay? So we work with this. Sometimes we have chronicles, sometimes we have archives, etc. But if Christianity is rather well documented, it is not the case of Islam. Despite the fact that we know that Islam developed side by side in Ethiopia for very obvious reasons. The Arabic Peninsula is just opposite, just on the other side of the Red Sea. Okay, so we should expect Islam to have developed very early on the African continent, on the African side of the Red Sea. And indeed, we have a number of scanty evidences. Epigraphic, that is inscriptions, archaeology, and even a number of written literary mentions. We know, for instance, that there are Arabic inscriptions here on these islands here, on the Dahlak archipelago in Eritrea. We have a number of tens of Arabic funerary Arabic inscriptions that were found here and that were recently discovered by a colleague of mine in France. A number of archaeological sites were known here, or also Zeila in today's Somaliland. A site here, Arla, has been excavated recently by my British colleague Timothy Insall. So a number of things are known in the landscape, about Islam. But strangely enough, we don't know where the Muslim polities were, despite the fact that Muslim polities are mentioned. Some are mentioned in the Christian texts. The Christians of Ethiopia mention their enemies or their partners. But they mention the name of a number of Muslim kingdoms with which they were dealing. But we don't know where these polities are. We even have this chronicle in Arabic, very short chronicle, 3 pages, that was left by a Muslim cleric at the very end of the 13th century. And it's called the Dikr at-Tawari. And this chronicle goes on to describe a number of sultans, kings, and gives a number of dates of events. So that means something happened. There was a kingdom, there was a sultanate of Shawa. It existed, but we are unable to locate it. Even more importantly, there was, in the 14th and 15th century, a huge Muslim polity called Ifât. For 2 centuries, that was a major political actor in the Horn of Africa. But where was Ifât? Ifât is mentioned in a number of Christian sources in Ge'ez, and Ifât is also mentioned in a number of Arabic sources outside of Ethiopia, including by the Mamluk chronicler Al-Umari in the 14th century. Okay, he describes Islamic Ethiopia, he describes a number of 7 or 8 Muslim polities in Ethiopia alone, and he goes on describing the Sultanate of Ifât, which was the major one, the main actor of this Muslim actor of this region, the main partner and nemesis of the Christian kingdom. But we are absolutely unable, well, we were until recently, unable to locate this Sultanate of Ifât. Al-Umari says that the Sultanate of Ifât measures 20 days, is kind of rectangle, 20 days by 15 days. Okay? But it's not very helpful in the whole of Africa, for the reason that I mentioned earlier. Okay? Because there is no way we can trace easily on the map a rectangle densely cultivated, as he says, okay? Anywhere in the Horn of Africa, because of the desert, which is the huge desert which makes a triangle, okay, in the middle of the space. So where was the Sultanate of Ifât? So that's the kind of question, and these are unusual questions for historians. We are not used to ask where exactly was the kingdom of Poland or the kingdom of France in the 15th century. I mean, these questions, we have answers normally, okay? But working in Africa means this kind of conveys this kind of question. Where was the Sultanate of Ifât in the 14th and 15th century? That was more or less the situation when I started to work in Ethiopia, and I spent a lot of time walking in the landscape with my teams and trying to find more archaeological evidence, rereading Arabic sources and Gaze sources, trying to figure out and trying to better understand, trying to make sense of this very puzzling question, where was the kingdom of Ifât? And 20 years ago, when doing pedestrian surveys, we eventually one day discovered a city, a ruined city in this place here. Its name was Asbury, and a huge, completely forgotten, built Muslim city is easily recognizable because of its mosque, and it became very quickly obvious that it belonged to the 14th and 15th century. So for a short time, we were convinced that it was the capital of Ifât. And the next day, we found another one, Masal, a huge cemetery, a huge Muslim cemetery. And then 2 days later, we found another one, Nora. So all of a sudden, in just a few days, we had 1, 2, 3 Muslim cities in the landscape, completely forgotten. And Nora, let me just show you what it looks like. You see the main mosque of Nora, very well preserved. It's built on a rocky spur, exactly within the rectangle that I showed you earlier. Okay? And on a rocky spur, there is a main mosque. There are 4 other mosques. There are dwellings, and there is a huge wall barring the spur. And all the characters of a large Muslim communities. This is a view of the inside of the mosque during the excavation that we did in 2008. You recognize on the left the mihrab, the niche, the prayer niche that is found in any mosque. And then a couple of years later, we discovered still another city. But this time, we were lucky enough that what we discovered made it clear that it was the capital of Ifât. How was it that obvious? Because what we discovered actually was a citadel, a city, and a graveyard, a necropolis, okay, and all these 3 sites were within a few kilometers from each other. This city, dating to the 14th and 15th century, is obviously the largest set of ruins ever discovered in Ethiopia, and we were lucky that on the graves that you can see on the top right of the screen, there were inscriptions. There were inscriptions of the dead. Okay, and these inscriptions were in Arabic. There were funerary inscriptions, and they gave the name of the people who were buried there. And these people, I just give here one example. It's a woman. But these people were members of the Walasma family, and we know that Walasma was the royal title of the kings of Ifât. And so we were able, all of a sudden, to understand that, well, finally that is the capital of Ifât, and which means that all the previous cities that we had discovered in the previous years probably also belong to the same polity. That means that Ifât was there, perhaps not only there, but Ifât was there. Clearly, the implication is that Ifât was not a rectangle. Okay? It was in the escarpment, okay? Within the escarpment, and possibly it had a remote extension at Zeila, that was the port, the harbor of the kingdom. It was clearly not a rectangle, okay, but it was something like a network. Okay, but the main body of cities of Ifât was in the the escarpment. If it took so long to understand this, it's because its location is extremely odd. It's because it's so counterintuitive to be here. Not only for political reasons. Politically, it's extremely weird that the capital of Ifât is here, because it's just 20 kilometers from the Christian kingdom. But it's also counterintuitive in terms of ecology. As I said, the Christian kingdom was just there. Okay? Just when you are at Nora or when you are at Ifât, you can see. I mean, the Christian kingdom was just a day of walk on top of the wall, but just one day. It's nothing. So why, as a Muslim ruler, why, as a Muslim community, would you set your main city, your capital, and all your other cities so close to the Christian kingdom, and in such an unfit environment as the escarpment? You may remember that it is exactly the place of the rectangle that I show you. Okay, so it is in the escarpment. It happens to be also on exactly the linguistic divide, okay? And this linguistic divide exactly overlaps the edge of the escarpment. So this line, okay, this line, this tiny line, this edge along the escarpment, which is just 20 kilometers wide, and which runs along the highlands, between the highlands and the desert, okay, is an ecological line. It is a linguistic line, and it is also a political line between Christian and Muslim. Why is it so? Again, let me show you. So this is what the archaeologists call a 3D block. Okay, so just to show you the Christian kingdom on the highland, okay, in yellow on my picture, the escarpment, which is much sharper than on the 3D block. Okay, you have to follow the altitude line, which is on the bottom, and the four cities I mentioned. Okay? So why would you put your cities here, right in the middle, between the desert, okay, and the highlands where the Christians were? And that's a big question. To start answering this question, we have to understand the escarpment as a threshold between two sharply different ecological milieux. As I said, the highlands and the desert. Because it is a threshold, because it is a limit between ecological milieu, and on the condition that the people who live there are able to organize connection between the top and the bottom, it's possible to exploit the difference in the ecological landscapes. On the islands, as I said earlier, seasonal cultivation, agriculture is possible. You can cultivate many things, cereals and vegetables. Obviously not all cereals, okay, but because all the cereals that we know do not grow at 3,000 meters above sea level, but at least teff, which is the main cereal eaten in Ethiopia, is cultivated on the top. And also animal husbandry is possible. Within the escarpment, the climate is completely different. Absolutely different. The climate is not winter, summer climate, like as we know in Europe, okay? It's a monsoon climate. And I experienced it when I excavated the site of Nora. All of a sudden, you have a tropical storm that arrives from nowhere. The kind of thing that do not happen on the highland, but that happened in the escarpment. It's literally a monsoon climate. It's something that the Ethiopians know very well. The Ethiopians say that in some region of their country, it is winter. It can be winter, but just a few kilometers afar from this region, it is summer. It's not the same climate at all, not the same rain pattern, not the same anything. It's not the same season. In the escarpment, tropical agriculture is possible. By tropical, I mean that you can raise banana, you can raise mango, you can raise all kind, you can raise sugar cane, all kind of tropical plants that would never venture on the top of the islands. Okay? And in the desert, no agriculture at all, and only camel and goat husbandry. So what can people do with this? Well, people can exchange. Okay. The highlands are, as I said, are densely populated and always were. And the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia was in command of this entire highlands, and was a producer of many things, was an exporter of many things: hides, skins, leather, slaves, gold. All kind of things that cannot be found in the escarpment. Okay? There are not enough resources. As I said earlier, this escarpment is just 20 kilometers wide. Okay? Just 20 kilometers. No much resources. You can cultivate banana and sugar cane, but not much resources, especially not gold, and especially not enough cattle to produce leather and hides, etc. And in the desert there is salt. The people who raise camel, they can also export salt and export salt towards the highlands, and on the highlands you can export many things to the lowlands. But the Muslim in the escarpment, they developed an expertise in their command of the routes toward the sea, the routes toward the Red Sea or toward the Indian Ocean, which the Christian could not easily do because the islands are barred by huge gorges. Okay? So circulation on the island is extremely complicated. It can take several days to make sometimes 20 kilometers. But along the escarpment, however narrow it is, it's a kind of highway, north-south highway. Okay? So a kind of economic symbiosis could develop between the highlands Christian sedentary agriculturalists, okay, and the people in the escarpment who developed these urban Muslim trading communities. This economic specialization along an ecological thresholds had an impact in terms of cultural differences. One was religion. Christianity developed on the highlands. It was the Christian strongholds for, it's been a Christian stronghold for now 1.5 million. Okay? While in the escarpment, the people who wanted to develop trade used Islam as a religious factor for trade and for connection with the wider Islamic world. Another factor of differentiation was language. Initially, it's very likely that the people on the top and people in the escarpment spoke the same language. Okay? But through time, and because of their economic divide, because of their religious difference, they developed two different languages, okay? Namely Amarinia in the highlands and Argobinia in the escarpment. These probably were initially two different dialects, but now there are two different languages, okay, spoken. So this is just an example of how an ecological threshold, how the landscape creates constraints and opportunities with which the societies create economic symbiosis and make cultural differences. This is an example that suggests that ecological thresholds worked both as economic interfaces and factors of cultural differentiation. Now let me broaden the picture. The example that I just took in Ethiopia, in a small region of Ethiopia, in many respects can be found in other regions of Africa. Not just because the rift is found elsewhere in Africa, but because you can observe something very interesting. You see, this gray region here is the region where almost all the medieval African kingdoms you know are situated. Okay, the kingdom of Ghana here, the kingdom of Mali here, Gao here, the kingdom of Ghâna and Mâli here, the Nubian Christian kingdoms along the Nile River here, the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, the Muslim kingdoms of Ethiopia and Ifât, and all the city-states that you may have heard of, Mogadishu, Mombasa, Zanzibar, Kilwa, Sofala, which were city-states in the Middle Ages. All these polities are found, interestingly, along ecological thresholds. Either the Rift Valley here, or the mangrove seashores here, okay, all along the coast, or the limit between the desert and the savanna, all along this line here. And again, this limit between the desert and the savanna is a very sharp divide in terms of linguistics, in terms of economy, in terms of ethnicity, etc. And even sharper is the ecological threshold between the desert and the river. You know, the Niger River here, or the Senegal River here, or Lake Chad here. It's really sharp. In Timbuktu, for instance, when you come from the north, okay, this is the Sahara, and the dunes arrive literally in the city. The last dune is in Timbuktu. Okay, so this is very sharp divide, all in just a matter of hours. You know, you go from the desert to an urban setting along a river. And so I find it interesting that all the major African polities that we know of during the Middle Ages were situated in a way or another along these ecological thresholds. I'm just going to take two examples. One in East Africa at Kilwa. You may not have heard of Kilwa. Kilwa was the major exporter of gold in this region of the world, okay, in East Africa, in the 14th and 15th century. Many sailors, many merchants coming from all around the Islamic empire, you know, from Arabia, from Persia, from India, etc., sailed to Kilwa to buy gold. Okay, that was the place to be when you wanted to buy gold in this region of the world. But Kilwa was just a tiny polity. Kilwa was just set on an island, a tiny island of Kilwa Kisiwani, off the shore of today's Tanzania. It's very small. It's, say, like Venice. Okay, it's very small, and of course there is no gold at all on the island of Kilwa. And it is known that Kilwa had no hinterland on the continent. Nothing, never. Okay? The Sultanate of Kilwa was just the tiny island, smaller than Warsaw. I'm not joking. Okay? So how is it that this Sultanate, that this African polity became so important during 2 centuries, so that it became the major economic interface between the eastern reaches of the Islamic economic basin and region of continental Africa where gold was found, and it could only be found on the Zimbabwean plateau, 1,000 kilometers inland. Okay? So that's an interesting case, and incidentally, the mosque of Kilwa is absolutely fascinating. It's still surviving today. It is this mosque here with a number of cupola. It's built of coral stone. Now let me give you another example, just across Africa, in West Africa. So again, we are on the ecological thresholds, okay, just between the desert and the savanna. Okay. This is, I'm just going to cite what al-Bakri was a famous Arab geographer in the 11th century, and he was very well informed. He was from Al-Andalus, from Islamic Spain, and he was very well informed about this region. And this is what he says. The city of Ghana, so this is the kingdom of Ghana, that has nothing to do with today Ghana, okay? Ghana was there. The city of Ghana consists of two cities situated on a plain. One of these cities, which is inhabited by Muslims, is large and possesses 12 mosques. The king's town is 6 miles distant from this one. The king has a palace. Around the king's town are domed buildings and groves and thickets where the sorcerers of these people, men in charge of the religious cult, live. So, what al-Bakri makes clear is that the king of Ghana is a pagan. The king of Ghana is not a Muslim. He belongs to a traditional religion. Okay, and his capital, Medina, is made of two cities, Medina, okay, separated by just 20 kilometers. Okay, two urban poles, twin cities. Okay? One for the Muslim coming from the north, Berber, Arabs, Persian, Egyptians, and one for the counterparts, West African people, non-Muslim people. Okay? And this city made of two cities was the dispositif, was the system invented by the king of Ghana to allow at the same time ethnic difference, religious difference, and economic articulation between the two. It is very likely that the city described by al-Bakri as being the Muslim settlement, the Muslim part, the Muslim city, of these twin cities, is this site. Okay? You cannot see it. Maybe not all of you can see an archaeological site here, but there is one. Okay, it is an infrared picture, and you see what you can see within the dotted line is a very impressive archaeological site. It's an archaeological mound, okay, of a city which is something like 10 kilometers of circumference. Okay, it's a huge medieval city. And it's very likely the Muslim component of, it's called Kumbi Saleh, and it's very likely the Muslim component of the capital of Ghana. And now this is how al-Bakri describes the exchange that takes place. I mean, why is it so? Why is it that on these ecological thresholds, okay, at the limit of the desert, in an environment which is a desert, where there never was a densely populated area around, nowhere. Okay? How did it work? Well, al-Bakri tells us, for every donkey load of salt when it is brought into the country, their king levies 1 golden dinar, and 2 when it is sent out. From a load of copper, the king's due is 5 mitkals, and from a load of other goods 10 mitkals. So, what is clear is that the kingdom of Ghana did not need to have resources. It did not need to have resources, and this is why its capital was on an ecological thresholds. Okay, because quite on the contrary to what we are used to think of in terms of political entities. You know, our kingdom, European kingdom, they need densely populated area. They need densely cultivated area just to extract the surplus, you know, and to feed the people and to extract taxes. But that was not how this worked. Okay, the way how it worked was by extracting taxes on import and export. Pretty much like brokers today. And so the way how it worked was a kind, what I call a commercial brokerage between partners. And taxes were levied only on exchanges, which implied a strict control over the condition and over the location of trading activities. And again, this ecological thresholds is a very important dividing line in terms of ecology between the desert and the savanna, between Islam and traditional religion. No? Islam on the northern side of Ghana, traditional religion on the southern side of Ghana. At this time in the 11th century, the king of Ghana was traditional religious. Between Arabic and Berber languages spoken to the north and West African languages such as Soninke, Mandinka, Fulani, Songhai spoken to the south, and between two separate networks, you know, the Trans-Saharan network to the north and the Wangara-Dioula commercial network to the south. It's probably the same way that the Kingdom of Mali worked 2 centuries later. The Kingdom of Mali took over the role of the Kingdom of Ghana in the 14th and 15th century. So in the 14th and 15th century, the King of Mali was really the big man in this region and had the same role in this region as the Sultan of Kilwa in the Indian Ocean. So, however counterintuitive it might be to put your cities, to put your capitals on ecological thresholds, it completely makes sense in terms of brokerage. These ecological thresholds are really high-value assets if you're not looking for agricultural surplus or for densely populated regions, but if you're looking for your own ability to put people together, to bring together people belonging to different networks, to be the if you're looking into being the interface between different ethnic groups, linguistic groups, commercial networks. So in a sense, if we reverse the perspective, ecological thresholds were ideal allocations in terms of connectedness. Or in other words, for African rulers, the control over narrow milieu, like the Sahelian ribbon, like the very narrow escarpment, like the very narrow mangrove seashore along the East African coast. These very narrow and very fragile milieu were ideal conditions if they were in control of someone. And for African rulers, control over narrow milieux, economic agency, balance between ethnic groups, and religious ambivalence were conditions of their participation in global dynamics. A good example of this connectedness is, of course, I am almost done, is of course the kings of Mali. This picture comes from a famous map which is called the Catalan Atlas. It was made by Jewish cartographers around 1375 at the end of the 14th century, and it's today preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. It is a map of the known world, and interestingly, the bottom part of this map shows the Kingdom of Mali, okay, and which is called Guinea, okay, and with a number of places like Ciudad, it's written in Catalan, okay, Ciudad de Mali, city of Mali, or Timbuk here, which is Timbuktu, and the king who is here is King Moussa, and he is described in Catalan here. I can translate for you in English. This black lord is called Moussa Meli, lord of all the black of Guinea. This king is the richest and the most noble lord of all this region, thanks to the amount of gold which is collected in his land. And so the map itself shows clearly enough that everything is about connectedness. Okay? And this sultan was known for being the major exporter of gold from this region through the Sahara, through the Muslim merchants. He was himself a Muslim. He performed the Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage, and he stayed some time in Cairo. He met a number of people. Many Arab chroniclers mentioned Musa's stays in Cairo. He was considered a very good Muslim. He was considered a very good Muslim king in the Islamic world. But I tend to understand this description here of Musa being the owner of the gold fields as evidence of his narrative agency, because actually we have no evidence that he was the owner of the gold fields, and rather in a number of other descriptions that we have, it's pretty clear that he did not have a direct control over the gold fields. Okay? So again, it's very likely that he was in a position of economic interface between, on one side, the broader Islamic world, and on the other side, the broader West Africa. And his role as an economic partner was to be the broker between these different worlds. And clearly, his interest was to make people believe in the Islamic world that he was the owner of the gold field. That's what brokers do. Okay, the job of brokers is just to make people between whom he is going to or she is going to make the deal, okay, unaware of what the other people know about the story. This is the narrative agency of brokers. My last slide is this one. I find it very interesting. It is a map that was drawn by the famous Arab geographer Al-Idrisi in the 12th century. And to understand this map, you have to understand that the north is toward the bottom, okay? And so Warsaw is probably somewhere here, you see? And this is Western Europe, this is Spain, okay, Iberia, this is Italy, this is Greece, this is Sicily. Okay? Idrisi was a cartographer in Sicily at the service of Roger II. And this is Africa here with this very strange shape, okay, crescent-like shape. And this is China here. It's written in Arabic, Al-Sina here. And Africa is here. Interestingly, in this world, okay, Africa is just opposite China. Okay? So this is, we have to understand this map as a conceptual map. And I suggest that it is a conceptual map of the Middle Ages. And that maybe the Middle Ages should not be defined strictly as a period of time, but maybe as a geography as well, within which Africa would have its fair place. Thank you very much.
you very much, Professor Fauvelle, for this inspiring lecture. Some of the research, especially the research on Ethiopia, was quite new to me, but you obviously touched upon many topics that have been present in African history for decades. And of course, I should start from the concept of ecological threshold as an origin of most of the early states in Africa. And I should say that as for the medieval period, I have to agree with you, because it would be very difficult to me to mention any substantial polity of the era that did not emerge on an ecological threshold. But obviously the history that doesn't end with the end of the Middle Ages, and right from the 16th century, we can mention already some new polities. For instance, in the interlacustrine or Great Lake regions in East Africa, that have the origin was quite different, and some of these very strong polities, like Rwanda, was not engaged in, as long as we know, was not engaged in any long distance trade. Uganda also started participating in long distance trade only from 1840s, right? And Rwanda opposed any external trade until the end of the pre-colonial era. So I just wonder if it's possible that our picture of the medieval period is somewhat blurred by the sources. We know only about these most substantial, I would say, polities. But why do we know about them? We know because of the sources, for instance, Arabic sources in Arabic, and these polities that participated in external trade were somewhat described by foreigners. But possibly there were some quite substantial polities that went into oblivion. We don't know much about them any longer. So it's also a matter of perspective and of the sources we have. And as for other well-known topics, I should mention, for instance, Islam as a vehicle for building certain economical networks. There is an old thesis that says that initially Islam was a religion of camel. Whenever people from our peninsula could reach by camel, Islam won. And Islam encompassed new territories, new societies. So somehow, originally Islam was also religion of trade. Yes, I'm not going to engage in any discussions at this point. Perhaps I will have some questions from Professor. I should also mention just certain thoughts connected with the East African coast that is so close to my field of interest. You mentioned Kilwa specifically, and when we look at the documentary sources for Kilwa, the chronicles, both chronicles of Kilwa, they do not say much about the mechanism of control of how these polities control the vast territories in the hinterland. But we know something about it from, for instance, 18th century sources. Monsieur Maurice, who was a merchant engaged in slave trade at that time, and who left a vast body of documentary sources, and who tried to understand and explain how Kilwa, not a powerful polity at that time, was able to reach as far as, for instance, Lake Malawi. No longer, of course, the gold fields of Zimbabwe at that time. But still, slave trade was a substantial source of income at the moment. So I just wonder how, to what extent we are able to apply the knowledge we have from the later sources to that earlier period. Also, you mentioned well, sometimes moietal or eclectic character of these centers of power and trade. I should say that you mentioned specifically ancient Ghana, quite different than modern Ghana. I should say that some East African towns on the Indian Ocean coast were in fact similar. From what we know about the archaeological excavations in Gedi, which is in Kenya, for instance. There was also a town of so-called patricians who presumably were considered ritually purer than the rest of town. The rest of town was more inclusive to people from the interior, non-Muslim people. So there are many of such topics that come to mind when we hear when we listen to Professor Fauvelle lecture. I think that it's enough from me, and I should ask you for questions, comments, hopefully from a specialist in different fields, archaeologists, historians, and also others. Please.
I have a just question regarding Kilwa, because I was wondering to what extent don't we think that counterintuitive cities are just, it's for us counterintuitive because we are not able to figure out how medieval cities were. For example, in France, during medieval cities. Okay. I was wondering to what extent the fact that city's location are counterintuitive for us is not connected to the fact that medieval cities are just counterintuitive. You say that Venice was quite small, Bruges was 3 square kilometers either, so maybe we have trouble because it's hard for us to figure out where can we find this. I have a question. I don't know nothing else about Africa. Do we know something about kingdoms in the sub-Saharan part on the map?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, you're absolutely right on the fact that there exist a number of African examples in Europe. If I may, turn around the appreciation of this question. And Venice is typically a completely counterintuitive place to place a major actor in trade, in long-distance trade. And its location is in that regard, its location is very African medieval. And there probably also are a number of similar examples in the Baltic Sea, in an early period, and there are actually a number of similar examples in this region. So yes, to answer your questions, in the European history too, there are a number of cases which which compares to African examples. So that's a very interesting thing to put in the discussion, and for sure. But it is not. It is still counterintuitive in the sense that when we think in terms of capital cities, we tend to think in terms of the geographical middle, and we tend to think in terms. I mean, it's always more convenient to put a capital city on the banks of the Vistule or the Seine River, than it is to put it, in the mountain, in the escarpment, on a shore or on a tiny island. So that's just that. But yes, you're right. And what do we know about? And that also a rejoinder to a previous question. What do we know about regions of Africa further south? Well, we know because of the archaeology, and the further south we go, or the further inland we go from the East African shore, the less we know based on written sources. And so not only the quality of our documentation changed, but the very nature of the documentation changed. It's not always easy, just based on archaeological remains, to know what it is, if someone here has read the Golden Rhinoceros and the chapter on Mapungubwe, for instance, Mapungubwe is this site in South Africa that was somewhat related to the very long distance trade, etc. How do we know it? We know it because we find in the graves of these people a number of items that could only have come from very far. Okay, from India, from Thailand, or from etc. And obviously, all these items came through a number of intermediaries, okay, and arrived there and were immobilized there. But what was Mapungubwe? It's much more difficult to say. Because we have no written sources. So, who were these people who were buried there with these jewels, with these beads, with these Chinese ceramics? That's very difficult. Were they kings? That's what many people say. But knowing the diversity of African social systems and political systems, I'm not sure that these people were king. In many places in Africa in the Middle Ages that are documented, people were not, the rulers were not necessarily king. They could have been priests, they could have been sheikh, they could have been other sort of dignitaries, And so it's much more difficult to make. This is something that archaeologists know, but it's much more difficult to make material vestiges speak. They do not speak on their own.
Just taking this example because it's to some extent my field of studies. I really liked it in your book, this Golden Rhinoceros, that you treat the archaeological and oral sources not only seriously, but with this healthy measure of distance, because I know the South African historiography, the British, American, and South African, and they always tend to say those were the states, empires, and so on. But when you write that, maybe that were states, but we don't know. And this is another point quite important, because in South Africa, in this South African circle of academics, they never took this idea of Glasen and Skalnik of early states, so this intermediary state of organization between the pre-state and the state. So I never found anything applied to this idea, and I think this is a really good way of looking, because I know that to some extent this concept or this interpretation that they need to be or must be, and I stress must be the state, is in fact embedded in the political discussion that there should be African states there. But we don't know. We know that there are these big stone constructions in Zimbabwe, which suggest that probably there was a more developed society, but that's all. Maybe there were such city-states.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. I completely share your views, but you know, many archaeologists have a very simplistic view about what is a simple society and what is a complex society. You know, but for me, all these categories makes no sense mostly, and I find it extremely difficult to draw conclusion based on beads or ceramics in terms of political organization. I mean, to go from beads to state is something that for me is extremely difficult to do. So when we talk, so based on strictly material vestiges, it's extremely difficult to draw conclusions. And that would be exactly the same if we did archaeology in Europe, you know, based on just collections of ceramics or whatever. Who would be able to say, that was a complex society with a multi-leveled, you know, hierarchy and a state? I mean, that's just impossible. That's just impossible. And we have to do justice to the inventivity of societies. Many things look alike, whereas the material are different, and many things were socially organized differently, while there can be the same material vestiges. So, and just based on what we know, if we excavated, you know, if it was a blind test, you know, if we excavated Venice, okay, in Italy, if we excavated Venice, I'm pretty sure that most archaeologists would say, yes, that was the capital of a huge empire. No, it was a tiny city-state with huge commercial ramifications, not an empire. No, it was a tiny city-state. So yes, so we have to be extremely cautious. That doesn't mean that we cannot say anything. We have to say things, we have to pose different scenarios, we can visit alternately these different scenarios, and we can, etc. But being critical is a way to be respectful to the documentation and I think it is very important.
And you know, even for the Portuguese time, when they were in contact with Monopotama, we have some academics have doubts if Monopotama is still Monopotama. Yeah, you are right. Is still a state. It's probably a kind of state, but even having the written sources, we couldn't be sure what it is. So
absolutely, and you know, even the city-states. You mentioned Gedi, but we can mention, you know, Mombasa, we can mention Kilwa, we can mention Sofala. I mean, all these different city-states were not alike at all in terms of political organization. Kilwa was a sultanate. Okay, so there were, in other places, there were patrician. It was an association of patrician families. In another case, Mogadishu, for instance, there were 4 lineages, each of which had its sheikh. So it was an association of the main aristocratic lineage of the city. So, you know, 3 cities and at least 3 completely different political systems. So that's interesting. That's a lesson, and we have to hear this lesson.
Thank you. I have just the short questions because I'm writing a book about the field of democracy in sub-Saharan Africa. My question is about the Mandingo, the Manding Constitution. I just would like to, because some argue that this is the fairest constitution in the world ever. I just would like to ask how is that? Is that true or not? This is one question. Also the interpretation of Professor of this constitution. And the second question about the links, the roots between the Jews, the Syrian Jews, and the Ghanaian and Mali, because the French professor devises. He found some links between the Jews, the Syrian Jews.
What, sorry?
The Syrian Jews and the Empire of Ghana and Mali.
Thank you very much. very much for your question. The first one is the difficult question, about this question about the constitution that was supposedly created in the 13th century at the time of Sundiata Keita in Mali. This is a question that I tackled, though not directly, but in my last book, in Les Masques et la Mosquée. Everything we know about the time of Sundiata Keita, 99% of what we know about the time of Sundiata Keita comes from the oral tradition, from the epic. An epic, the epic of Sundiata. The epic of Sundiata is an epic, okay, that was collected in many different regions of West Africa, mostly in Mali or in Guinea, or in a couple of cases in Gambia, with griot, with bardic people. And this usually is a long poem that is performed, okay, in front of people. A number of versions were collected, recorded, transcribed, translated, and are available to researchers. So we work with this oral tradition. For some people, these oral traditions are documents from the past, directly from the 13th or 14th century. For me, as a historian, I consider these documents 20th century documents. They are just because they are collected in the 20th century. They say something about the past, which does not mean that they are documents from the past. Okay? This difference is in the approach, explains a lot in terms of what to do with the oral tradition. Some people say, let's believe 100% of what is in the oral tradition, and some people like me say, well, let's criticize first, let's compare the versions first, and let's find out what is really hard, in this different version. For sure, Sundiata did exist. How do we know this? We know this because Ibn Khaldun, the famous Arab historian of the late 14th century, proposed a reconstruction of the genealogy of the sultans of Mali. Okay, and he says that the founder of the dynasty is called Mari Jata, and you recognize the same name, Jata, meaning lion in Mandinka. Okay, and so for sure this founder existed. But now, as it comes to the details of the epic, the places of the battle, the name of the people, and the event that took place, I think that we must be very cautious about this. I think that we can use and say a number of things, but I tend to think of the oral tradition and the epic of Sundiata as a kind of charter that explains, a charter for the Mandinka-speaking people today that explain the present in the past. Because that project in the past a number of things that explain the present. So I personally do not really believe in this constitution, oral constitution in the 13th century. Now, when it comes to your second question, it is true that about Jews, Syrian Jews in West Africa, it is true that a number of historians have mentioned these hypotheses. I do not believe in them. And let me tell you why. Because first, we have no evidence at all. Not a single piece of evidence, either written or material, of the presence of Jews south of the Sahara before the 16th century. Okay? After the 16th century, that was another matter. It is documented that there were a number of Jews in Mauritania, in different cities, but before the 16th century, before the 15th century, and during the Middle Ages, there were none. Why was it so? Because it was extremely dangerous for Jews to venture outside the Islamic world. Outside the Islamic world. Within the Islamic world. That means within countries protected by the Quranic law, that made completely sense for Jews to travel, to be merchants, etc. Okay, and they were protected. Okay, and they could benefit from the Quranic law, and they could benefit from a network, etc. But outside the Islamic world, that would be extremely dangerous for Jews to venture. And actually, we have no evidence at all. There is not a single paper, for instance, not a single Jewish archive, okay, attesting the presence of Jews south of the Sahara, despite the fact, for instance, that we have huge Jewish archives from the Cairo Geniza. I don't know if you know of the Cairo Geniza, but the Cairo Geniza is a secret room that was in the attic of the synagogue, of the old medieval synagogue of Cairo, and this synagogue has preserved hundreds of thousands of documents from the 10th century to the 19th century, and all these documents were found at the end of the 19th century when the synagogue was destroyed in order to be reconstructed. Okay, and all these documents are a wonderful treasure that attest to many things, to trade with India, to trade with Marseille, to the presence of Jewish communities, marriage contract, etc. All kind of documents. And we have not a single paper attesting to the presence of Jews. So I think it is a historiographic myth, and there is no, this is my perception, and someone else might have a different opinion. But my opinion, my take is that there were no Jewish communities outside of the Islamic world in the Middle Ages.
Thank you for the answer.
No more questions?
I've recently read a master thesis from University of Dar es Salaam about archaeological excavations on Comoros Island, proving that there is a mosque that was built as early as late 7th century, and it's the only research about it, and I'm wondering, is it even possible that it's true?
Whose excavation are these? Stéphane Pradine?
I believe so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yes. So yes, absolutely. There is a very early, and you might be right. It might be. Sorry, I'm too close. It might well be the first mosque, the most ancient mosque documented in this region, which is very interesting because it is on the archipelago, on the Comoro archipelago, which is very interesting. Which again testify to the fact that these early Muslim communities liked to be not in direct contact with the resources, but rather in kind of interface position, between the continent, the wider Islamic world, the northern part of Madagascar. I mean, it was always better to be in a kind of gatekeeper place than directly on the gold fields. And so yes, and it is very interesting. And also the excavation at Dembeni in the Comoro yielded a number of very interesting artifacts like rock crystal. Again, Comoro has no gold, has no rock crystal, has basically nothing of value to export, but very interestingly, it was able, the Muslim communities there was able to import things from Madagascar, import things from the African mainland, import things from other regions, transform things and re-export things, etc. Crystal is very interesting. Rock crystal, the mine of rock crystal are known in Madagascar. Okay, so, and the excavation by Stéphane Pradine showed that the people at Dembeni in Comoro imported blocks, big blocks of rock crystal and quartz. Absolutely pure quartz, translucent quartz. Blocks that they imported it and then they shaped it. And he found the tiny chips at his excavation, and then they re-exported these shaped blocks to Egypt, where there were specialized workers into the sculpture of these things. I mean, to make wonderful objects, some of them now being in Venice, or in different places. So there was a kind of long distance, trade and system of trade and transformation of these objects in many directions. Because obviously we are talking now about things exported from region of Africa to the outside world, but there were also things imported from outside in Africa. And for instance, I should mention the Chinese ceramic. And in many regions of Africa, we find these wonderful Chinese ceramics that were imported, and if not designed and made in China for an African market.
If I may add shortly, we got this excavation on Comoro Islands, but also in the coast of Kenya. There are traces of Muslim communities as old as the 8th century in Shanghai and other parts of the northern part of the Kenyan coast. So later on, these ports, and also the ports in what is now Tanzania, participated in the Indian Ocean trade. In fact, the trade was from the pre-Muslim era. We got a written document called Periplus of the Eritrean Sea from the 1st century after Christ, right? So it's nothing new. Rock crystal is very interesting, and from what I remember, it became so popular with the growth of Caliphate, with the growth of Islam. Perhaps not in the 7th century, but a little bit. Sorry for this comment. Any other questions, please?
Thank you very much. Excuse me, but I can't help myself. I'm an architect, and I understand that you do not really appreciate the oral tradition. However, we've got an example of a map, and I understand that you are very attached to this map. Do you believe that Timbuktu looked like this on this map? That this building on the side of Mansa Musa really existed?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood properly the question.
On this map, on this picture, to the left of Mansa Musa, there is a building.
Yeah.
A palace.
Yeah.
Did it exist actually?
Oh, excellent question. Well, it is a strange building, as you can see. Admittedly, all the cities represented on this map are represented usually in a very schematic way, okay? A round wall and something, spanning out and etc. and a flag, okay? And that's a very standardized way to represent a city, like you see Sudan, or like Gaogao, or like Maïma, or like etc. Or like Ciudad de Mali, okay? City of Mali. This is not the case of Timbuktu. No round wall and nothing spanning out, okay? And we have this strange building with cupola on top. Okay. So why did the cartographer or why did the drawer represent Timbuktu that way? That's a question. A colleague of mine, a friend of mine, Bertrand Poissonnier, who made excavations in Timbuktu a few years ago, within the great mosque of Djinguereber, okay, found, that's wonderful, found that these buildings in West along the Niger River are made of earth. Okay, it's called banco. The architecture is called banco. It's made of big brick of raw, unbaked earth. So this kind of building needs constant refection and rebuilding. Okay, so every year there is a refection, and every 10 or 20 years it's partly rebuilt. So it's always the same building and not quite the same building, okay, that survived through time. Typically in Timbuktu, the building that we see today was made a century ago. Okay? But before this, what Bertrand Poissonnier showed is that it was rebuilt several times. And it goes deep 8 meters. There was a first building that was made in the 14th century, and it is dated. So yes, there was a huge building at the place of the today's Timbuktu mosque that presumably was already a mosque, and it is dated to the 14th century. So very likely, one of the first mosques built in Timbuktu was this one. Okay, it was built there, and there was a mosque built in Timbuktu, etc. Was it like this? Well, it's difficult to say. And was it a building with cupola? This is an hypothesis that Bertrand Poissonnier has made in a recent publication, that it might be that this drawing might be a realistic representation of the first mosque that was known at the time, that was made at the time of Mansa Musa in the 14th century.
So maybe it's time for my question. It also concerns this scanty documentary material on the early history of Africa. And from what you say, and I basically agree with that, the most important body of material is archaeology and, of course, documentary sources whenever we have them. But recently, not quite recently, but during last, let's say, 3 decades, there have been attempts to use toponology, for instance, for the period between the year 1000 and 1500. What do you think? What is your opinion on the potential toponology?
So, okay, so I need to explain for everybody what glottochronology is. You know, what comparative linguists do is to collect languages, okay, compare languages, and once you have identified languages that belong to the same subfamily or family, you can reconstruct a language that is no longer spoken, but that did exist, okay? Based on all the Slavic languages spoken today, it would be pretty easy for linguists, and actually it's being done, to reconstruct proto-Slavic or proto-things that no longer are spoken, but were. Based on Romance language, it would be pretty easy to reconstruct Latin, or actually Low Latin, a spoken language that was spoken around the 6th to 8th century, and not exactly literary or written Latin. But whatever the case, based on the comparison of the lexic, of the comparison of the grammar and comparison of the morphology, okay, we can reconstruct state of languages that are no longer existing today. This method, this reconstructive method, is used in a number of disciplines. It's used in genetics, it's used in linguistics, it's used in philology, it's used in many things, and it is pretty solid, it works, okay? On the condition of certain precautions, okay? And one of the precautions is that it is not because you can reconstruct a word that your reconstruction is true. Because sometimes you can have borrowing. Let's say, for instance, that it would be pretty easy, based on Romance languages, to reconstruct the word tomato in Latin. Because tamati in Dutch, tomate in French, tomato in English, tomato, blah, 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 blah. All this makes sense. Okay, there was probably something like tomatus in Latin, but no. Tomato is a 16th century innovation. Okay, so there was no tomato. So that's the kind of precaution that comparative linguists must take. Okay, make sure that a reconstruction is really a reconstruction and not a borrowing. And when it is a borrowing, there are other rules that apply. Words are borrowed and adapted. In French or in Polish, words have been adopted and adapted, and sometimes they reflect the morphology of the the origin language, and sometimes they are adapted in the morphology of our languages. All these are rules and all these are precautions. Okay, now, so you can reconstruct, and basically you obtain some sort of genealogical tree. Okay, we have all the language spoken today and the proto-languages spoken, let's say, 500 years ago, and then the proto-languages spoken 2,000 years ago, etc., etc. You can, and now glottochronology is when you cannot control your genealogical tree. If I want to reconstruct Latin, that's very easy to control because we have Latin text, okay, dating back 2,000 years ago. Okay, if I want to reconstruct, I don't know, if I want to use to reconstruct Ghâs, Ethiopian languages, classical language, okay, that's pretty easy. We have text in Ghâs from the antiquity. Okay, so that's pretty easy. But before we have any written attestation, how do we control? How do we know if a proto language was spoken 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago? Okay, so some comparative linguists use a tool which is called glottochronology, which is based on the idea that all language, exactly like our genes, you know, there are a number of mutations. Okay, and statistically, a number of mutations take place every hundreds of years. Okay, so to do justice to a number of difference between two languages, let's say that 90% of the lexicon match except 10%. So based on the glottochronological tool, I would say, okay, that means that these two languages separated 300 years ago. Okay, that's the problem of that glottochronological tool is that it was calculated based on the European languages, because we can control over 2,000 years. Okay, and the frequency, of the mutations, but we don't know at all how other families of languages encounter mutations. So I personally and many linguists and many historians are very, very cautious about the glottochronological tools, and in my opinion it cannot be used alone. It can be used just to give kind of blurred idea. It can give you a relative idea. Such change took place obviously before a number of, for instance, if the same word for the same tool is shared by a number of societies, okay, this change took place at one moment, okay, and it took place after an earlier other change that are not reflected the same way among the same populations, okay. So it's pretty easy actually, based on linguistic tool, to show that tomato was imported in the 16th, 17th century among the European languages, and that this shift took place after a number of other changes that took place earlier, etc. So I personally am very cautious about glottochronology, but I find it, but it doesn't impede, the validity of the comparative linguistics as a discipline.
Thank you very, very much. Are there any other questions? If not, it's time to thank you for this very instructive lecture, and also thank you for all the questions. I think my questions was the worst one, because you had to explain what were.
And I completely forgot to answer another question about Islam and trade, etc. But that will be for another time. Thank you very much.